Australia heads to the polls tomorrow with opinion polls suggesting a victory for the Labor Party. But that may depend on smaller parties and independent candidates supporting a minority government. History shows it's never too late for parties to come from behind and snatch a surprise victory. Roger Maynard reports from the marginal Sydney seat of Parramatta.
Set in the heart of Sydney, Parramatta is nearly 30 kilometres from the CBD. It's also one of the most culturally and politically diverse seats in the country.
We're kind of in the middle of Sydney here. You know, any way you divide Sydney in half, Parramatta's usually on the border. You've got the kind of more affluent eastern side and the more working class side to the west. You've got the more multicultural side. The Parramatta's on the kind of almost but not quite on the North Shore. So there's a lot of ways in which Parramatta is that dividing line of Sydney, and in one sense that also applies to elections, that, you know, you've got Liberal voting suburbs to the north and Labor voting suburbs to the south, and Parramatta is where they meet.
And that's reflected in the range of candidates. There are no fewer than 8 people putting their hands up for election, from Labor's Andrew Charlton, the sitting member, to Ganesh Loke, an entrepreneur of Indian heritage who's standing for the so-called Trumpet of Patriots.
Australia needs to change. Like, there has been so many issues, like the cost of living going up. You know, there's issues with the first-home buyers. They cannot buy home. House affordability has gone up. There are no jobs for younger Australians. So we want to change that.
Liberal candidate Katie Mullins, who's worked in the area for the past 17 years, is a lawyer who knows that many Australians here are struggling financially.
Well, we need to rein in the wasteful inflationary spending, and we also have some great cost of living relief that we're offering. You will see in the truck behind me advertising one of our big policies. We're going to halve the fuel tax, so it will be 25 cents a litre off your petrol as soon as we get into government. That's immediate cost of living relief that will make a real difference in Western Sydney, where a lot of people drive.
Among the changes the Liberals want is a broader energy base with a mix of renewable, gas and, more controversially, nuclear power. But nuclear energy is anathema to Labor.
The case for nuclear power, if you look at it from a business end, is not very strong, and if you look at it from a public support end, does not appear to be very strong either. So this is quite a bold policy from the opposition to suddenly announce that it is proposing to build up to 7 nuclear reactors around the country, and to do so on the public purse, that is to build them using government money and to operate them using government money. A strange and quite courageous decision by the opposition, which positions itself as a party of small government and free enterprise.
More immediately, it's the Greens who might provide the key to this election.
The best case scenario from my perspective would be a hung parliament with the Greens in the balance of power, so we can push Labor to do better.
Smaller parties and independents are increasingly making their presence felt, both nationally and locally, and they could have the final say. Although past Australian elections suggest nothing can be taken for granted.
I would say, though, you know, we had a big polling error in 2019, and that could happen again. And if the polls do prove to be incorrect, then, you know, we could see a coalition victory. They're not that far behind.
With pre-polling available for more than a week now, it's just possible this election has already been decided. But with so many independent candidates, it's really hard to predict the outcome with confidence. Roger Maynard, CNA at Parramatta in Sydney's geographic heartland.
Well, joining us to talk about these elections, we have Gordon Flake. He's CEO of Perth USAsia Centre at the University of Western Australia, and he joins us from Perth. Mr Flake, we cannot take for granted what might happen tomorrow. But what we do know is that even as recently as February, polls suggest a very different outcome from what we might see tomorrow. So a lot has changed even in just the last few months.
No question. In 2024, there was a broad global trend against incumbent governments. There was concern about years of COVID response. There was real concerns about supply chain disruptions and inflation. So as you rightly pointed out, at the beginning of this year, I think the presumption was that the incumbent government, the Labor government, would lose, and that the coalition government, the coalition between the Liberal Party and the National Party, would likely win. Regardless of the outcome tomorrow, It is a very tight race, and if you trust the polls, they suggest that Labour is on track to probably win again, and maybe even win with a slightly larger margin than they did last time around.
And the system of structural, how it's carried out, the voting, for example, preferential voting, for example, these things, in fact, encourage a more nuanced approach to interpreting results.
Well, they certainly do. It's very important to understand that among democratic societies, Australia has a couple of innovations which are quite different. One is mandatory voting. We end up having a voting system that requires everybody to vote. Not everybody does. It's a relatively small fine, but we end up with about 98% of the populace voting in elections. And the second thing, as you rightly have pointed out, is that you have a system of preferential voting, which means that you have to rank choice voting your preferred candidates. And so if no candidate gets more than 50%, and it's very rare that on the first ballot they will, then the last place candidates' votes are then allocated based on their second and third preferences to other candidates in the race, and then so on and so on. So what it does, is build a broader consensus. And so the first ballot, the first choice isn't always the one that's going to get you across the line.
So in other words, for parties to win votes, it does not actually benefit them to appeal to extremes of opinion in the electorate.
Absolutely. You have to compete for and win the middle. And that's not only in terms of your voters, the Labour voters or Liberal voters, but also you have to be able to appeal to the broadest number of independent voters as well. So even if they don't vote for you on their first choice, you want them to rank you second or third in terms of their preferences, which means that you will collect their votes later on in terms of the process. So again, it's a political system which tends to drive a national consensus as opposed to national division.
So one of the final lines coming from the incumbent Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, Australians in uncertain times need continuity. The country needs continuity as we go forward. So the suggestion is vote for me and you will get stability, certainty and continuity. As a policy message, is this likely to be going down well now?
Well, it wasn't going down well last year for incumbents around the globe. In this year, given the uncertainty primarily coming out of Washington, D.C., with tariffs, with kind of a broad undermining of what we in Australia like to call the rules-based order by its principal author, the United States, there is a lot of uncertainty, economic uncertainty, trade uncertainty, policy uncertainty. And so in that environment, a message of certainty, of stability is relatively attractive, certainly more attractive than it was just 100 days ago or 3 or 4 months ago.
So the vote, whichever way it swings now, will not be a vote in favour of radical, profound radical change that Australia might in fact need at this point.
That is true. I mean, one of the criticisms of the Australian system is it does not encourage policy innovation. You don't have the deep divides. You don't have the polarity that has kind of torn countries like the United States apart. But at the same time, you don't also have a lot of just fundamental shifts and changes. So the main two parties, the Liberal Party and the Labour Party, tend to be more similar than dissimilar. I often say that the entire Australian political spectrum could largely fit within the US Democratic Party. Having said that, there is innovation. There's just far more consensus than there is innovation. Your news report at the beginning of this segment, talking about power, nuclear power, that's innovative. It's also risky.
And also in that report, one election analyst saying we saw a big polling error in 2019. So we look back at the past. So the last election was framed deliberately by the incumbent leader now as being a referendum on the leader then, and he was not popular at that point, which might have swung the vote in favour of Anthony Albanese. This time is not a referendum on any particular leader, is it?
So the polling era that was discussed earlier was the polling era that took place in 2019 when everybody assumed that the incumbent at that time, the coalition government or the Liberal National government under Scott Morrison, would lose, and they turned out to have won by a narrow margin. The most recent election in 2022, just 3 years ago, was an election which, as you rightly described, was a referendum election. The Labour government, which is the government now, the opposition then, pursued what we call a small target election, which means there was almost no daylight between them and the government of the time, the government of then Prime Minister Scott Morrison. And that made it a referendum on the person, that people were not voting on policy. Again, there are policy differences, on environment, on energy, on international relations. But compared to other countries around the world, they're relatively narrow in Australia today.
So 2019, 2022, and now 2025, and we will see what happens in those elections tomorrow. Gordon Flake, CEO of Perth USAsia Centre at the University of Western Australia.